Good evening. So you can tell by the title that this is part one. There is so much to cover in this section, section F, that I had to split up over 2 weeks, and even then, it's still a lot to cover. So we're going to kind of move a little quickly tonight, so just kind of hang on. If you got questions, you can jot them down, but there's a lot of stuff to go over. So just to kind of review a little bit, last week we talked about Jesus' trial before Pilate and his appearance before Herod, and then I gave you some background on the Roman trial. This week I want to touch a little more on geography, just again to give you these visuals, because some of us are visual people, we like to have a visual relationship kind of thing. We're going to talk about crucifixion, and I'll give you some comments on the text. So again, here's our orientation of what's going on. Here's the temple. This is the actual Holy of Holies here. This is called the court of the men. There's the court of the women in here. So Jewish women were allowed in here but not beyond this gate. Jewish men were in here but not allowed this door. And this is the court of the Gentiles. Everybody can be in that area. Here's Kidron Valley. Mount Olives out here. It seems like forever since we talked about Mount Olives, doesn't it? It was just a few weeks. On the other side of this square area here is the retaining wall that we call the Western Wall. So it'd be like this wall, but on the other side. Over here is the Fortress Antonia. Over here is Herod's Palace, the two leading candidates for the Praetorium. Over here was Caiaphas' house. And we're going to talk a little bit about this area over here. Okay, so we'll look at it from the other side too. And then remember, all this is just residential area and commercial businesses and things like that. So we talked about last time we talked about where the Praetorium is. I said there's arguments for Herod's Palace, there's arguments for Fortress Antonia, but I'm erring on the side of Fortress Antonia, mostly because the Stations of the Cross have been walked and prayed in Jerusalem for over 1,000 years, start over in this area, and so the presumption is it was over here, and then they went out to Calvary this way. So we're going to call this the Praetorium. So there's the Fortress Antonia again, up close. Remember, this is the wall of the court of the Gentiles, so it's attached to the temple. Remember, we said that the high priest robes were kept there by the Romans. That's one of the ways they had control over the Jewish culture, was by keeping the robes that the priest had to wear, the high priest had to wear when he went into the temple once a year. Okay, I also put some pictures up in here. So if you walk the Stations of the Cross, anybody here been to Jerusalem? Okay, so if you walk the Stations of the Cross, along each of the 14 stations, there's this round plate that has a Roman numeral in the middle of it. It's kind of like decorative spikes all around, kind of like a sun. I call them the hubcaps because they look like hubcaps from a fancy car. But along the wall, there's these hubcaps marking the 14 spots. Okay, and these are on city streets, so there's businesses and all kinds of things going on in these streets, but there's these markers. And you've got groups walking the Stations of the Cross through the city streets of the old city of Jerusalem. And everybody's trying to get you to come into their store. You come see my store. You come see my store. Come and buy my things, because they want you to buy stuff because that's where they make their money. There's all the tourists. And so even though you're trying to pray to Stations of the Cross, they're trying to get you to come into their stores. It's kind of interesting. Well, you saw that, right? Yeah. So these are some things along each of the stations. Sometimes there's a place you can actually get off the street and go in and pray. It's probably just like the size of a closet in most cases, but it is someplace you can get off the street and pray for a minute if you want to. Not that a whole group could go in there. You're talking like 2, 3, 4 people in most cases, and that's it. So this is in that chapel I showed you the pictures last time, the stained glass windows where Jesus is condemned to death, the first station. This is a little chapel marking the second station where Jesus takes up his cross. You can see there's an altar there. This is marking where Jesus falls the first time, the third station. Again, there's an altar here where people can pray. It's not an altar for really saying Mass. It's really more just a place to pray and put candles. Very small. There's a statue here of Jesus falling up the way of his cross. Here's the 4th, 5th, and 6th station. So the 4th station, Jesus meets his mother along the way. And there's the hubcaps up there on the walls. His Roman numeral 4 and Roman numeral 6. You can get off the street for a second and stop in where there's this relief on the wall of Simon helping Jesus carry his cross, the 5th station. The 6th station is simply just the hubcap, and then there's this little mark on the wall that's got some Greek writing on it, and this guy pressing his face up against it as a way of having physical contact with the place where Veronica wiped the face of Jesus. Then you've got the 7th, 8th, and 9th stations. The 7th station does have a little altar where Mass can be said. That's where Jesus falls the second time. The 8th station, there's the hubcap against the Roman numeral 8 up there. This is where the women of Jerusalem weep over Jesus. There's no place to get off the street here. That's just the marker for the 8th station. And then here's the 9th station, the same kind of thing. It's just a Roman numeral 9, and that tells you where the 9th station was. And that's where the stations of the cross people stop to pray. The 9th station, which is Jesus falls the 3rd time. When you get past 7, 8, and 9, you're getting really close now to the end of the stations of the cross. The brief history is from very, very, very early on, within 100 years, people were going to the spot where they believed Jesus was buried and rose from the dead. And over time, they're building a bigger building, a bigger monument. Meanwhile, they're going to the place where Jesus is crucified, and they're going to that place too and praying, and they're building shrines there and building builders. Well, these two places are so close together that eventually the buildings, as they keep adding to it, becomes one giant building. So if you go there now, it's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but Calvary is inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and so is the tomb. It's all one giant complex now, okay? So as you're walking the stations of the cross, you go past the 9th station, you go to the 10th station where Jesus stripped of his garments, you're pretty much inside the building now. And then the 11th station, Jesus is nailed to the cross, and the 12th station, Jesus dies on the cross. All 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14 are all in a complex called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Okay? So you've got 9th station, then you got the 10th and 11th station. It's also the building. Interesting enough, on the side of the wall by the 10th station is this icon, it's a mosaic actually, of Abraham, Isaac, knife in the hand, angel stopping him. Remember the story in Genesis 22? Okay. If you ever want to do something really fascinating, go back and compare what happens to Abraham and Isaac to what happens to Jesus. It's a really beautiful reflection. What God does in the case of Abraham and Isaac, what God does not do in the case of Jesus. Go back and read that. It's a really interesting parallel. In fact, in the Easter Vigil every year, one of the readings that's always read is the account of Abraham and Isaac. That's how important it is in our salvation history. So that icon is there. And then over here, this is the 11th station. Jesus is nailed to the cross. This is the altar. This is where we had Mass. And that altar is probably 6 feet wide. There's probably 2 feet, 3 feet on either side of that altar. And the space in front of it's probably about 10 or 12 feet, and 50 of us had to cram in there for Mass. That's why we were spilling over to the other area and getting yelled at. So anyway, so that's the stations of the cross through the 11th station. Okay, and then here, all right. So here's Fortress Antonia. So you remember what would be over in this area, right? The temple, right? There's the court of the Gentiles, and then coming across this way, the temple would be here. This is the Praetorium, and then somewhere along in here there would have been a gate, and this is the area where Calvary is. So you notice it's outside the wall. Okay, this wall represents the wall of Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. Shortly after Jesus' death and resurrection, there's a whole bunch of new stuff added onto Jerusalem. So the outer wall is now out here someplace. But this was the outer wall of the city at the time of the crucifixion. And so this would have been outside the city wall. Because crucifixions, stonings, burials, all of that stuff would have had to been done outside the city walls. You never did that stuff in the city walls.
How long is the actual walk then, Father, from the beginning to
so
Calvary?
From the Praetorium, he's coming out this door here.
So it's
Yeah, it's 5 minutes. Yeah, but it's 5 minutes through crowded streets where people are running around getting ready for Passover, and it's and then they're coming out because they hear there's a commotion, so they're coming out to see what's going on. So it would have been a very short walk, but a lot happened on the way. So if you think about Stations of the Cross, all those things that happened, it's actually not a great big distance. The only reason it's a big distance if you walk it now, the Stations of the Cross, because it's windy. It's a very windy route, circuitous, is that the word? Okay, so that's so what I want to talk about now is I want to talk about the crucifixion and the crowning of thorns and the scourging at the pillar. This is what I told you about. This is going to be kind of graphic, but I think it's important we understand what our Lord went through for us. So the first thing I want to talk about is the crowning with thorns. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to show you. This is the 12th station here. This is the altar, the Greek altar. Interesting enough is somehow in this photograph, the letters are backwards. But anyway, so this is the altar. In this circle area right here, you can actually reach down inside of that, and you can touch the spot where the cross of Jesus stood. Okay? So I have a picture someplace else of myself, venerating at that spot. And then above the altar, so this is the altar standing like this high, and it's about this wide. On the wall behind it is this. This is Jesus on the cross. There's a lot of lamps and things. Very Eastern style worship area. A lot of lamps hanging from the ceiling with candles in them. Kind of like the lamps we have in our devotion area, those little lamps that we have. Except there's like dozens of them. Down here, this is St. John and this is the Blessed Mother. So the parts of their body that are showing, the face and the hands, are showing. But notice all around them it's gilded metal. So it's like silver plate around them. So remember, icons are windows into heaven, so it's showing the glorified version of the Blessed Mother and St. John in eternity with Jesus on the cross here. So this is the artwork above the altar here, so it would be like sitting right up here. Okay? All right, crown of thorns. So the text tells us that it was from a plant, a thorn plant. Well, there's lots of different kinds of plants that have thorns. We know that. There's roses that have thorns. There's bayberries that have thorns. There's all different kinds of plants that have thorns. So what's believed by the historians is that they went over to one of these bushes that had these thorny things, branches on it. You wouldn't have been able to take something like a thorn bush and weave a crown out of it. That wasn't going to happen. So what they probably just did was they cut off a section of these bushes with thorns on it, and just stuck it on his head. Okay? It wasn't like they wove a crown. It wasn't a diadem. It wasn't like something like you see in a lot of the pictures, like this very thin layer of spiky things going around. It wasn't probably like that. It was most likely like this. Why do I say it was most likely like this? Well, first of all, it would be a whole lot easier to produce. And don't think that the soldiers are sitting around for an hour trying to figure out how to not stab themselves with these thorns while they make something that's going to mock Jesus. Okay. The other thing is that a couple other pieces of evidence outside the scriptures seem to allude to this. One is there's a very ancient drawing on the wall of the catacombs, those underground places where Christians used to gather in secret, of a man with lots of people around him looking at him, wearing something like a giant yarmulke. You know what a yarmulke is? The little skull cap, except bigger, with spikes sticking out in every direction. That's on the wall. That's very, very early Christian art. So that's one piece of evidence that says that maybe that's what it was. The other one is, we're going to talk in 2 weeks, we'll talk about the Shroud of Turin. But if you look at the Shroud of Turin, it appears to be that there's all over the man in the shroud, there's all over the place these blood drops. So not just around here, but all over the place. Okay. So again, we'll talk about that when we talk about the Shroud of Turin. But it seems to be it was something more like that and not just a diadem that was going around. Okay. It was meant for mockery. It was to mock him. Remember they put the reed in his hand in Matthew's gospel. They put the cloak on him. This was meant to be mockery. He's a king, let's give him a crown. It wasn't intended to be a way of torture. That wasn't something that we see other people being tortured by the Romans with a crown of thorns. It was a mockery thing. It hurt. I'm not saying it didn't hurt, but it wasn't their purpose. So that's the crown of thorns. By the way, this is a reliquary. This is a fancy reliquary in a church in Rome that I'll talk about in 2 weeks again. Santa Croce in Jerusalem, Holy Cross in Jerusalem. And these are believed to be two of the thorns that were from the crown of thorns. So they're in a reliquary in a church in Rome. Okay, what about the scourging? Scourging was always part of a sentence of crucifixion. So anybody being crucified would have been scourged first. Okay? The reason why is the amount of scourging controls how quickly the person dies. There's a direct correlation. The more a person's scourged, the faster they die. So if they wanted somebody to be on that cross for a long time, they scourged them a little. If they wanted them to die quickly, they scourged them a lot. Okay? So scourging was always part of crucifixion. If it was a free person, so a Roman citizen, they didn't crucify Roman citizens. But they did sometimes use something like flagellation or scourging on Roman citizens, but it would have been done with rods. Remember a few years ago, where was it at? Was it in Bangkok? No. The kid that was caned. Like 20 years ago? Gosh, 20 years ago already? It was someplace in the Orient. So he was caned, and it was a big deal about that. Lesson to self, by the way, if you're going to go to countries where they torture people, don't break laws. just a little advice. So they used rods on freedmen. If it was a soldier and they were going to do a flagellation or scourging, it would have been done with sticks. Scourges was used only for people who were not Roman citizens or soldiers. So foreigners, slaves, they would have been scourged. So Jesus falls into that category. He's not a Roman citizen. He's not a soldier. So he's scourged. He's not beaten with rods. Okay? What did it mean to be scourged? So you can see here you got a handle, and you got these whip-like leather straps coming off the handle. Embedded in the leather straps are pieces of bone. And on the end, either metal balls, like a little bit like a ball bearing, or hooks, metal hooks. Okay? So the person using this would have wound up and had a lot of momentum and inertia carrying that through as they applied it to the person that they were scourging. If you look, here's a picture of somebody being tied to a post. That's generally what they did so that they couldn't, A, fall down, and B, pull away or try and block the scourging. This is a picture overhead. This is the person's head receiving the scourging. This is their arms being tied. Okay? This is the person applying it. So you can see he's bringing it like this. So if this is the person's body, I'm off the camera, but if this is the person's body, and I'm right-handed, and I'm standing on this left side of him from behind, and I bring the whip down, it's going to be doing these marks right here. Okay? If I switch to left-handed and switch to the other side and bring it down, because my arm is getting tired and I have to switch hands, then that's where you'll get these marks coming in this way. I even saw one account talk about there was two people applying it, taking turns, and one striking this way and one striking this way. So sometimes scourging was done on its own, not just as a way of crucifixion, but it was something that was done sometimes as a punishment. Sometimes as a punishment, sometimes for extracted confession, like torture. Scourging would have been used for that too. Matthew and Mark, different from John in their account of when the scourging happened. Mark and Matthew have it after the trial, which makes sense historically. So Jesus is condemned to crucifixion, so as a prelude to crucifixion, he'd have been taken out and scourged first. And that's what Mark and Matthew give you. John places it in the middle of the trial. Remember, John's version of Pilate is a Pilate who's trying to let Jesus go. So Pilate is thinking that if I just scourge him and bring him out as a bloody pulp in front of the people, maybe they'll say, well, you treat him bad enough, we'll let him go now. So Pilate in John's gospel does it in the midst of the trial as a way of trying to get the crowds to let Jesus go. Where Mark and Matthew do it at the end. And you notice who doesn't have it at all is Luke. Okay? So that's the scourging. As far as crucifixion, so the Greek says he was crucified on a cross. The Greek word is stauros, the Latin word is crux, C-R-U-X. It just refers, any stauros or crux could just be a stake in the ground to which could be attached a crossbeam, but not necessarily. And the person would be attached to this post, to this stake in the ground, and that would be crucified. So it doesn't have to be the cross like we think of with a long beam and then a short one across. It doesn't have to be like that. It could just be a stake in the ground that the person was attached to. They could have been instantaneously killed on that. They could have been hanged on it. They could have been impaled. So you tie the person to the stake and you shove something through their body and kill them instantly. It could be that you left them there to hang and to, take a long, slow death. They could be nailed to it, they could be tied to it. So crucifixion in general doesn't necessarily mean what we think of when we think of crucifixion. A big upright beam, a cross beam 3/4 of the way up, and a person nailed to it. It doesn't necessarily mean that all the time. It was usually a slow means of death. Many cultures used crucifixion before the Romans did. Sometimes they even crucified people after they died. So they might kill somebody another way and then crucify their body. Okay? It's kind of like, you hear stories like in the time of King Henry VIII, where somebody's beheaded, they take the head and stick it on a post so everybody sees it. So killing somebody and then crucifying their body and leaving it there is a great deterrent. This could happen to you. And the Romans used it that way, sometimes. So they sometimes used it to kill somebody, and they sometimes just used it after the person was dead, and they just left their body up on the cross anyhow. Again, it was usually for slaves and foreigners. The Romans used it a lot. In fact, at one time, they crucified 800 people all at once. So it was a lot. So when you think about that, there wasn't 800 crosses like we think of crosses. They weren't taking the time to make 800 of those. So what they had probably was a series of stakes that were always left in the ground, and they would just bring people out and attach them to them, sometimes with a crossbeam, sometimes without. And so they could do a whole bunch of crucifixions all at once. There's another account that says in 4 BC, 2,000 people were crucified on the same day in the same place. 2,000. Josephus Flavius, we talked about before, the Roman historian who was Jewish, calls it the most pitiable of deaths. And Seneca, the Roman senator, called it the accursed tree. Now, what was the shape of the cross then? Okay. So this is what I was telling you about the stick in the ground. It's just called a crux simplex, okay? So this would be stuck in the ground, and they could tie the person onto it, they could nail the person onto it and leave them there, okay? And those most of the time probably stayed in the ground. Okay. What we usually think of as a cross of Jesus is this up here, okay? So this would have been this piece stuck in the ground all the time, most likely, and just the crossbeam would have been carried by the person out to their crucifixion. Okay? And it probably would have been like this as they were carrying it. There could also be what's called a tau cross. If you know that Franciscans, they usually wear a tau cross. It could be this too, where this post was stuck in the ground, there was a notch in the top of it. And so the person coming out with crucifixion is carrying the crossbeam. They're tied to the crossbeam as they're walking to the crucifixion site. And then they're raised, there's like a hook or something on the top, and they're raised up. And that crossbeam is set into the notch at the top of the upright post. Okay, and then when they're taken down, the crossbeam and the person are taken down and the post is left in place. Okay. Same thing with this one here. So most likely, the picture you see where Jesus is carrying something that looks like this through the streets of Jerusalem, probably not the case. Probably the post was already in the ground. He carried the crossbeam. And then if they did have this kind of a cross, because the scriptures don't tell us, we're not concerned with that, they would have attached this piece to here to keep it in place, and then he would have been crucified that way. Okay. This is interesting. This is a Crux de Crusada, and the legend says St. Andrew the Apostle was crucified on one of these. So out like this. Nailed to the cross. Okay. These other crosses are just shown because they're different kinds of crosses. Most likely people were not crucified on these. This is a Greek cross. It's important because a lot of the early Orthodox and early Catholic churches are built in this shape. This is called a patriarchal cross. It has an extra piece across the top representing the title that was the inscription on the cross. And if you go to an archdiocese liturgy, like the Archdiocese of Chicago, Archdiocese of Indianapolis, and you have a big fancy liturgy, they usually are carrying a cross in the procession that has 2 bars on it, one longer one and one shorter one. So it's also called a patriarchal cross or metropolitan cross. And then you've got the Eastern Orthodox cross. You'll see these in a lot of Orthodox churches, like on the domes and stuff. You'll see this kind of cross. This representing the crossbeam, this representing the title, and this representing the footrest of a